Outer Rep Level 26.
Lesson 3. Say it another way. Passive voice. Part 3. Start with any verb.
Outer Rep.
A neighbor hit my cousin Tom in the head and broke 2 of his teeth. He then went to a law office, talked to a young female attorney for an hour, and finally decided to retain her. He later filed a lawsuit against the neighbor. Broke.
Outer Rep.
A neighbor broke 2 of my cousin Tom's teeth after he'd hit Tom in the head. Tom then went to a law office, talked to a young female lawyer for an hour, and finally decided to retain her. He later filed a lawsuit against the neighbor.
Outer
Went.
Rep.
My cousin Tom went to a law office and retained a young female attorney after he'd been talking to her for an hour. He said he'd file a lawsuit against the neighbor that had hit him in the head and broken 2 of his teeth. Talked.
Outer Rep.
My cousin Tom had been talking to a young female lawyer for an hour after he finally decided to retain her. He went to the law office because a neighbor had hit him in the head and broken 2 of his teeth. He'd been working in the garden. He later filed a lawsuit against the neighbor.
Outer Rep.
Decided. My cousin Tom decided to retain a young female lawyer after he'd been talking to her for an hour. He came to this law office after a neighbor had hit him in the head and broken 2 of his teeth. He later filed a lawsuit against the
Outer Rep.
bad neighbor. Filed a lawsuit. My cousin Tom filed a lawsuit against the neighbor that had hit him in the head and broken 2 of his teeth. He'd gone to a law office, talked to a young female lawyer for an hour before he
Outer
finally
Rep.
decided to retain her. Passive. Tom went to an attorney's office. He'd been hit by a neighbor in the head. 2 of his teeth had been broken. He talked to a young female lawyer who was finally retained by him. A lawsuit was later filed
Outer
against the
Rep.
neighbor. 1. The sick mother died. Her little boy cried a lot. He ran away from the house, then went into a church. There he met a priest that told him to go home. 2. My mother and I went into the
Outer
Paradise supermarket. She picked up some vegetables, gave the money to the cashier, and left the store. I followed her. 3. The pharmacist stood at the door of her drugstore. 3 men came in, showed her a gun, and told her to give them the money.
Outer Rep.
They took her to the safe, she opened it, and got the money for them. They left the store at 7:10 p.m. The police came 10 minutes later. 4. My father got married to my mother in 1960. 3 years later, she gave birth to my eldest sister. They named her Rosie, after my mother's middle name. I was born 2 years later. 5. I met my husband in
Outer Rep.
1986. We dated each other for 2 years. He proposed to me. I decided to marry him, and we got married in the spring of 1988. 6. I'll go to a bookstore tomorrow afternoon. I'll
Outer
choose a
Rep.
good dictionary, and I'll buy it for my sister. I'll give it to her at 6 p.m. in the evening. She'll like it. 7. My girlfriend will come to see me next month. I'll introduce her to my parents. We'll probably get married next year.
Outer Rep.
Part 5. Idiomatic expressions. Idioms. Meanings. Examples. 4. Better late than never. It's important to come, even if late.
Outer Rep.
When the application was finally approved, despite the delays we'd suffered, It was better late than never. 5. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. There's greater value in what you actually have than in what you might get. I sold the
Out-of-ref.
bicycle for $500. If I waited, I might get a higher offer. I decided that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. 6. Birds of a feather flock together. Because he was always with the drug dealers, the jury
Out-of-ref.
found him guilty, assuming that birds of a feather flock together.